And I always think about, how do we get there? Mm-hmm. And what are the implications of that? And that's why I think you get to absolute liberty.
Yeah.
Whereas I think of the consequences of moving from where we are as a collectivist society to absolute liberty, what that means and what's going to work and what doesn't work. And what about the people who don't want it? You talk about what is society. I don't think there's any hard definition apart from what a dictionary would tell you, but society for me is perhaps the boundaries within which laws exist. So within the UK, you have a UK society because they're fixed by a fixed set of laws. Whereas the US, you have a US federal society, fixed set of laws, but you also have state regulations. So you have state laws, but you can also talk about society as smaller groups. Mm-hmm. So there's, I think you can attribute it to kind of multiple definitions.
Yeah, you can, but that's the danger, right? Because then you can have someone come into a position of power inside of that political hierarchy, and they can justify any action they want to take for the good of society.
Yeah.
Isn't that what Trudeau just did?
He did.
For the good and safe, whatever bullshit rhetoric he's pumping out to freeze individuals' bank accounts and blatantly violate their private property rights in broad daylight for all to see. And then he can sweep that under the moral camouflage of, oh, it's good for society and we're fixing the state or helping. I didn't pay attention to his rhetoric, but that I think is the problem, right? Because you end up with this infinite scapegoat of a useful fiction that you can just paint anything. That's what Stalin did. That's what everyone did. They never did anything that was actually bad. Well, they never admitted to it.
They never admitted to it. But
that's what I'm saying. It was always for the good of society, always the greater good. Some appeal to a useful fiction. So that's the point I'm trying to make is there's a danger in that. Like we need the useful fictions to scale and organize ourselves and communicate, right? We need to talk about these different groups of people, their interests and all of that. But we have to remember that it is a fiction. All of them are fictions. The individual is real. Only the individual acts, thinks, decides, uses means and ends. If we start extrapolating individual thoughts, feelings, actions onto a group, that's when the lines get blurry and people can, tyrants in particular can deceive and confuse us.
I agree. But I also recognize the challenges of building excuse me for using it, a society based on just the individual and the removal of coercion. Because I don't think you can ever remove coercion. I just think it exists either under a structure of law or a lawless structure. Mm-hmm. But I still think it exists because men, and mainly men, let's be honest, are aggressive, domineering, ambitious individuals. And wherever you see a breakdown in society, breakdown in law and order, you tend to see oppression, violence, rape. Oh. So if we're going to discuss the problems in, say, democracy, let's start with democracy, and we want to move more to individualist society, we have to talk about what does that mean? Because you can look at countless examples around the world of where it's complete failure of society. And see, the thing is, the way I see of the reason I like democracy or Western liberal democracies, not currently, there's a lot of problems, is that I think it's a leveler. Mm-hmm. And I think it gives the opportunity to create rules and laws and a structure for millions of people to operate under. And it is completely and utterly flawed, I get it. But I also find I can't see the world of the individual, the sovereign individual, that isn't one that's still governed by hierarchy. It's just a different hierarchy. And the ability to use violence against others because you control greater wealth or you control a greater set of arms without the rule of law, I think you would still have coercion, and you could possibly even get back to the stages of slavery and other forms of coercion. And I only think, I know where you go with this, but that requires every person to be a good, decent person.
Well, all right. Number of things to unpack here.
Yeah.
One, I would say the first, just to put a button on the useful fiction thing. So we're talking about like the US society or UK society or the US economy versus the UK economy. Again, these are all arbitrary useful fictions we're drawing around a
What do you mean by fiction?
When you say the US economy, where do you draw the lines around that? Like which transaction is the US economy versus an international economy? Especially in the digital age, like all these bright lines we have in Keynesian economic models, like they're being increasingly blurred.
Sure, but like it's not a fiction. There is a US economy, which is the
Well, what do you do? All right, so for instance,
it's the gross domestic product of every person who lives within that country.
okay, so this particular show,
Yeah.
your audience is presumably somewhat international.
Yeah.
Okay, so like where are you actually creating economic value?
I probably create economic value in two places, well, multiple places, which is fine. But my revenue is on my P&L, which is recorded by a British accountant and gets reported to HMRC in the UK. So I contribute to the gross domestic product of the UK.
Right. So even when you're measuring something like in a GDP terms, and this is why the Austrians are so anti-measurement everything, because it's still arbitrary. You've taken an arbitrary formula, applied it to an arbitrary scope of trade and said, this is the number that represents this. But it's still, there's an element of arbitrariness that goes into it. So here's my general point is this.
So just to say is that I'm not a fan of GDP. And the reason I'm not a fan of GDP is because there's that constant need for growth. And the constant need for growth, I think, distorts money.
Yes.
But at the same time, the British economy is not a fiction. It exists.
I think there's only one economy.
Or global economy.
That's right.
Okay.
Just like there's only one weather, right? We can say there's US weather, there's UK weather, but in the end, it's one complex system that's all interconnected.
Yeah, but
and this is the butterfly effect, right?
But you can still break it down.
Yes, and it's useful to break it down.
Yeah.
But the actuality, the reality that we live in is that it's all continuous, it's all interconnected.
I think it's useful to break it down because
and that's why I say useful fiction. It's very useful. Very useful to describe ourselves as Republican versus Democrat or leftist versus rightist, right? There's all these utilities to the fiction, right? Even words themselves, like ultimately, you and I share meaning that we assign to a certain word. That's how we communicate. But that word is not the thing we're describing, right? There's a phenomenon that's deeper and more complicated than that word. So just like the words themselves are useful fictions, we build these larger fictions.